that.
Imagine this. You're in your home, in the dead of night. The house is silent. But then, you hear it. A sound. A low, persistent sound that doesn't belong. It's not the house settling. It's not an appliance. It's not the neighbor's. It's a sound with no source, no explanation, and no end. Today, we are going to share 4 true, deeply unsettling stories of people who were tormented by an unexplained sound that never stopped. It is a unique and maddening form of psychological torture. The real horror isn't a monster you can see. It's a sound you can't escape. It's the slow, creeping erosion of your sanity as you search for a logical explanation that doesn't exist. It's the doubt from your friends and family, the frustration of repairmen who can't find the source, the terrifying realization that your own safe space, your home, has been invaded by a sound that is slowly, methodically, driving you insane. But what are these sounds? Are they glitches in our perception, or are they echoes of something real and terrifying? By exploring these true accounts, from a constant low hum in a suburban house to the sound of a baby crying from a forest that has no children, we will delve into the chilling mystery of these auditory hauntings. These stories are more than just creepy tales. They are a disturbing look at what happens when the silence is broken by a sound that the world says isn't real. Now, before we listen to the silence, make sure you are subscribed to Whispered Fear and have activated the bell. You don't want to be the only one who doesn't hear the warning when it comes.
It's the house. It's singing.
Our first story is about the quietest, most insidious kind of haunting. It's not a story of ghosts or monsters, but of a sound, a simple, persistent, and unexplainable sound that can worm its way into the cracks of a perfect life and slowly, methodically, tear it apart from the inside out. It comes from a young couple, Tom and Sarah, who bought their dream home, only to discover it came with a built-in maddening and inescapable secret. For Tom and Sarah, the house was the finish line. At 31 and 29 respectively, their life had been a textbook example of delayed gratification. They had met at Ohio State University, gotten married, and then spent the next 7 years living in a series of cramped, overpriced apartments in Columbus, meticulously saving every penny. Tom's job as a civil engineer for the Ohio Department of Transportation was stable but demanding. Sarah's work as a freelance graphic designer was a constant hustle. They had sacrificed vacations, fancy dinners, new cars, all for this one singular dream, a quiet, safe, forever home in a good neighborhood to raise the family they hoped to start. They found it in Westerville, a peaceful, idyllic suburb northeast of Columbus. The house, on a quiet, tree-lined street called Sunbury Road, was a beautiful 1960s brick ranch. It wasn't perfect. The kitchen was dated, the basement was musty, but it was solid. It had a big backyard, and it was theirs. The silence was the first thing they fell in love with. After years of living with the sounds of noisy neighbors and city traffic, the profound, peaceful quiet of the house felt like a luxury. It was the sound of their future. For the first month, their life was a dream. They spent their weekends painting walls, planting a small garden, and making the house their own. The silence was their constant, welcome companion. It was the sound of safety, of a life finally truly beginning. The humming started in their second month. It was so faint at first, they both thought they were imagining it. It was a low frequency, a sound you felt as much as you heard, like the distant thrum of a large generator or a bass note from a song being played miles away. It wasn't constant. It would come and go, a low, resonant vibration in the air that would last for a few hours, then vanish for a day or two. Sarah asked one evening, pausing with her fork halfway to her mouth, "Do you hear that?" Tom tilted his head, listening. "Hear what? The fridge?" she said. a small frown on her face. No, it's a humming? He listened again. He couldn't hear it. He dismissed it as tinnitus from a long day at a noisy construction site. Sarah, prone to migraines, blamed it on the barometric pressure. They found logical, plausible explanations because the alternative, that their perfect, silent house had a secret noise, was too unsettling to consider. But the hum grew more persistent. And soon, Tom could hear it too. It was most noticeable in the quietest hours, in the dead of night, when the rest of the world was asleep. It was a pure, clean, low-frequency tone, a single unending note that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the house. It was a sound with no discernible source. Thus began the investigation. It was a logical, methodical process, a perfect task for an engineer like Tom. Their first suspect was the refrigerator. They unplugged it. The humming continued. Next was the yeek system. They shut it off at the main breaker. The humming continued. The water heater, the sump pump, the attic fan, one by one, they silenced every appliance, every mechanical system in the house until they were sitting in a completely powerless, silent home. And the humming was still there. Low, steady, and inescapable. The logical, domestic explanations were exhausted. It was time to call in the professionals. Their first call was to a CP Ohio, the electric company. A friendly, patient technician came out, checked the meter, the lines coming into the house. He'd said with a shrug, "Everything looks perfect, folks. Your power is clean. Whatever that sound is, it's not coming from us." Next was a team of electricians. They spent a full day crawling through the attic and basement, testing every outlet, every circuit, searching for a faulty ground wire, a vibrating transformer, anything. They found nothing. The light electrician told them, a look of genuine bafflement on his face. "This is one of the quietest electrical systems I've ever seen. I can't explain it." They hired an HVAC specialist, an acoustical engineer, even a structural engineer from Tom's own firm. No one could find the source. The sound was a ghost. It defied physics. It existed without a cause. The mystery began to take a psychological toll. The house, their sanctuary, was now a source of constant, low-grade stress. The silence they had once cherished was gone, replaced by a permanent, maddening hum that was always there, just at the edge of their hearing. Sleep became a refuge they could no longer count on. The hum seemed louder at night, a resonant, vibrating presence in their bedroom that seemed to get inside their very skulls. They would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, just listening. Their once harmonious relationship began to fray at the edges. The sleep deprivation made them irritable, short-tempered. They began to argue, their hushed, angry whispers a new, ugly sound in the house, and they noticed something terrifying. The humming seemed to respond to them. When they would argue, the volume and intensity of the hum would increase, as if it were feeding on their negative energy. When they were quiet, it would recede to its usual, barely audible level. The house was no longer a passive container for the sound. It felt like the sound was an active, conscious entity, a malevolent presence that was listening and reacting. Sarah said one night, her voice choked with tears, "I can't live like this anymore. Tom. This sound, it's not just a noise. It's a feeling. It's making me sick. It's making me feel watched." Tom, a man of concrete and steel, was struggling. His logical mind was at war with his own sensory experience. He couldn't see the source, couldn't measure it, couldn't fix it. It was an engineering problem with no solution, and it was destroying his home, his wife, and his own sanity. He started to do his own more radical experiments. One night, he rented a portable generator from a Sunbelt Rentals in Columbus, and, after shutting off the main power to the house, he used it to power a single lamp. He was determined to prove that the sound was somehow connected to the electrical grid, a strange vibration from a distant power plant. Perhaps. He sat in the dark, silent house. The only light, the soft glow of the lamp. The only sound, the chug of the generator outside. And the humming was still there, faint but undeniable. It was not electrical. The final, desperate explanation was that it was in their heads, a shared auditory hallucination, a folie à deux. The thought was both a comfort and a terrifying admission of defeat. Maybe they were the ones who were broken, not the house. Driven by this last, desperate hope for a rational explanation, Tom did something drastic. He hired a specialized team of acoustical consultants from a firm in Cleveland that usually worked on concert halls and recording studios. It was an expensive, last-ditch effort. 2 technicians arrived with a van full of sensitive, high-tech equipment. They spent a full day in the house, setting up parabolic microphones, spectrum analyzers, and vibration sensors. They worked in a quiet, focused silence. Tom and Sarah watched them, a fragile, desperate hope hanging in the air. At the end of the day, the lead technician, a serious-faced man named Dr. Evans, called them into the living room. He had a laptop open on the coffee table, its screen displaying a complex series of graphs and waveforms. Dr. Evans began, his tone grave. "Well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is, you're not crazy. The sound is real. We've measured it. It's a persistent, low-frequency acoustic signal, resonating at a near-perfect 55 hertz. A wave of validation so powerful it was almost dizzying, washed over Tom and Sarah. It was real. They weren't imagining it." Tom asked, leaning forward, "So, what is it? A water pipe in the foundation? A gas line?" Dr. Evans shook his head slowly. "That's the bad news. The sound is not mechanical. It's not electrical. It's not coming from any system in your house." He turned the laptop towards them. He pointed to a graph. "Our sensors have triangulated the source. It's originating from a single point, approximately 15 feet directly beneath the center of your living room. It's coming from the earth itself." Tom and Sarah stared at him. "UNCOMPREHENDING." Sarah whispered. "The earth?" Dr. Evans continued, his face grim. "But it's not a natural sound. Natural seismic or acoustic phenomena are erratic. They have fluctuations. This is a perfect, clean, unwavering sine wave. It's the kind of signal that can only be produced by a precisely calibrated, artificial source. It's a machine." The room was silent for a long moment. The only sound, the faint, omnipresent hum that was the subject of their conversation. Tom said, his voice a dead, flat monotone. "So, what you're telling me is that there is a machine buried under my house that I can't see, that no one can get to, and that I can't turn off." "Precisely," Dr. Evans said. I've never seen anything like it." After the technicians left, Tom and Sarah were left with the horrifying, impossible truth. They were living on top of a machine that was humming day and night, a single, maddening, unending note. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He went to his computer and began a new, more terrifying line of research. He searched the property records, the geological surveys, the history of Westerville. He dug deeper than he ever had before, into old, declassified military archives, into obscure engineering forms. And in the early hours of the morning, he found it. It was a single, heavily redacted document from the 1950s, a progress report from a defunct DARPA project. The project was codenamed Project Chimera. The goal was to research the potential of using extremely low-frequency ELF acoustic waves as a form of non-lethal psychological warfare. The report detailed the construction of a series of small, experimental, and self-sustaining subterranean acoustic resonators designed to generate a persistent low-frequency hum. The targeted effects on the civilian population in the test areas were listed in a cold, clinical font: increased anxiety, sleep disruption, paranoia, and a general degradation of cognitive function. The locations of the test sites were redacted, all except one, a series of coordinates for a patch of what had, in 1955, been empty farmland, miles outside the city limits of Columbus. He typed the coordinates into a modern GPS map. The pin landed directly on the center of his own quiet, tree-lined street directly on top of his own perfect brick ranch house. The final horrifying truth was not that their house was haunted. It was that their house had been built on top of a forgotten weapon. Weapon that was still on. The humming wasn't a ghost dot. It was the sound of a silent, 60-year-old psychological experiment that had never been turned off. The responding nature of the hum, its seeming intelligence, was just a cruel coincidence of acoustics. The sound waves bouncing differently in the house in response to their own voices. They were living in a cage, not a haunted one, but a meticulously engineered one. A cage designed to slowly, methodically drive its inhabitants insane. They put the house on the market the next day, but they had a moral and legal obligation to disclose the issue. They told their realtor the truth, the story of the hum, the story of the report. The house, their dream, their entire life savings became unsellable, a toxic asset. They are still there today, trapped in their beautiful, perfect, forever home. They are prisoners of a sound that no one else can fix, a sound that the government that created it refuses to acknowledge even exists. They live in a constant, low-grade state of psychological torment, their lives a quiet testament to the ghosts of our own history, the forgotten weapons we have buried just beneath the surface of our own quiet suburban world. The humming never stops, and some nights, when the world is quiet and the house is still, they swear that the single monotonous note is beginning to sound, just a little bit like a quiet, patient, and unending laugh.
Can you hear me?
Our next story is about the slow, methodical erosion of sanity. It's about a sound so simple, so insignificant, that it should be easily dismissed. But when that sound never stops, it can become a form of psychological torture, a tiny hammer, chipping away at the foundations of your reality. It comes from an elderly woman named Margaret, who learned that the walls of her home were not a barrier, but a conductor, and that the rhythmic tapping she heard every night was not a ghost, but a desperate, terrifying, and very real conversation that she was never supposed to overhear. At 78, Margaret's world had become a small, quiet kingdom. Her domain was a historic, two-story, single house in Charleston, South Carolina, a narrow, elegant home on Church Street that had been in her family for 3 generations. After her husband, Robert, had passed away 5 years prior, the house, once a bustling hub of family life, had grown quiet. Her children, now grown with families of their own in cities like Atlanta and Charlotte, would call every Sunday, their voices a cheerful but distant echo of the life that once filled these rooms. She was alone, but she was not lonely. The house was her companion. It was a living museum of her own history. Its familiar creaks and groans the ghosts of 1,000 happy memories. She was a woman who was comfortable with silence. Her life was a symphony of quiet, predictable routines. She would wake with the sun, tend to her small, walled-in garden, and spend her afternoons reading in the living room, the salty air from the nearby harbor drifting through the open windows. The house was her fortress against a world that was growing too loud, too fast. She was safe. She was content. The tapping started in the spring. It was a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a woodpecker on a distant tree. A soft, rhythmic tap, that seemed to be coming from the wall of her second floor bedroom, the one that faced the street. She dismissed it at first. An old house, an old tree, a branch tapping against the brick in the wind. It was a logical, simple explanation. She would barely even register it. But the sound was persistent, and it was not random like a branch in the wind. It was rhythmic. A steady, deliberate pattern. Tap dash tap tap. Pause tap dash tap dash tap. It was always the same, and it only happened at night, usually starting just after. She had turned off the lights and settled into bed, the time when the house was at its most silent. She tried to find the source. She would get out of bed, her old bones protesting, and press her ear against the cool plaster wall. The sound was definitely coming from inside. A faint, internal vibration. She checked the window. The old oak tree outside was a good 20 feet away, its branches nowhere near the house. She checked the radiator. It was silent, cold. She mentioned it to her son, Michael, during their next Sunday call. His response was loving, but dismissive. "It's probably just the pipes, Mom. Old houses make weird noises. You know that." She knew he was probably right, but the sound didn't sound like pipes. It sounded like someone was knocking. A tiny, patient, and persistent knocking from deep within the walls of her room. The sound became a fixture of her nights. It was no longer a minor annoyance. It was an intrusion. The quiet, peaceful moments before sleep were now filled with a tense, expectant listening. She would lie in the dark, her ears straining, waiting for it to begin. And it always did. Tap dash. Tap tap pause. Tap dash. Tap dash tap. A maddening, unending rhythm that seemed to be counting down to something. Sleep, once a gentle refuge, became a battle. The constant, low-level sound kept her on the edge of wakefulness, and she would drift into strange, anxious dreams, all set to the soundtrack of that relentless tapping. She grew tired, her usual calm and steady demeanor giving way to a frayed, irritable exhaustion. Her quiet, orderly world was being slowly, methodically picked apart by a sound she could not explain. Her daughter, Laura, noticed the change in her voice during their next call and insisted on driving in from Charlotte for the weekend. Laura was a whirlwind of practical, loving energy. She listened to her mother's story with a patient, but skeptical expression. "Okay, Mom," she said. "Let's figure this out." Together, they conducted a series of experiments. They turned off the main water supply to the house, eliminating the possibility of a strange pipe vibration. The tapping continued. They shut off the main electrical breaker, plunging the house into darkness and silence. The tapping continued, its rhythm even clearer in the absolute quiet. Laura pressed her ear to the wall, her expression of skepticism slowly melting into one of confused unease. She admitted, "That's really weird. It sounds like Morse code or something." The next morning, Laura was on the phone, her voice a mix of concern and efficiency. She called a plumber, an electrician, and a structural engineer. Over the next week, a parade of polite, professional men came through Margaret's house. They tested the pipes. They scanned the walls for electrical currents. They checked the structural integrity of the old brick. They all came to the same conclusion. There was nothing wrong with the house. There was no logical, physical explanation for the sound. The professional's verdict was the final, devastating blow to Margaret's peace of mind. If the sound wasn't the house, and it wasn't her imagination, because Laura had heard it too, then what was it? The quiet, ordered world she had built for herself was now haunted by a question with no answer. The ambiguity was worse than any monster. It was a slow, quiet poison. She started to feel like a prisoner in her own home. The bedroom, a place of rest for over 51 years, became a torture chamber. She started sleeping on the sofa in the living room, but even there, in the quietest hours, she could sometimes hear it, a faint phantom echo of the sound from upstairs. One night, driven by a sleepless, desperate curiosity, she decided to respond. She lay in bed, listening to the familiar, maddening rhythm. Tap dash tap tap pause. Tap dash tap dash tap. With a trembling hand, She reached out and knocked on the wall beside her bed, mimicking the pattern. She knocked 3 times with her knuckles against the cool plaster. The tapping from inside the wall stopped instantly. The sudden absolute silence was a shock. It was more terrifying than the sound itself. She lay there, her breath held, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She had made contact. The thing in the wall, whatever it was, knew she was there. It knew. She was listening. After a long, silent minute, the tapping returned. But it was different. The pattern had changed. It was no longer a steady, rhythmic beat. It was frantic, chaotic, and aggressive. A furious, desperate flurry of taps that sounded like an angry, trapped animal trying to claw its way out. Margaret scrambled out of bed, a strangled cry escaping her lips, and fled the room. Slamming the door behind her. She spent the rest of the night on the sofa, huddled under a blanket, listening to the furious, muffled sound of the enraged tapping from upstairs. The next morning, the house was silent. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, menacing, like the quiet before a storm. She knew she couldn't live like this anymore. She was a 78-year-old woman, but she was not helpless. She had lived through a war, raised 2 children, and buried a husband. She would not be driven from her own home by a noise in the wall. She decided that the only remaining possibility was the one she had been avoiding, the one that seemed too much like something out of a cheap horror novel. The house next door. The house on her left, the one that shared the bedroom wall, had been sold a few months ago to a young, reclusive man, a software developer who worked from home. She had only seen him a few times. A pale, thin young man with dark, intense eyes, who would hurry from his front door to his car, never making eye contact. He was quiet, too quiet. She had to know. That afternoon, she walked next door, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm. She climbed the steps to his porch and rang the doorbell. She could hear the faint sound of music from inside. After a long moment, the door opened a few inches, held by a chain lock. The young man, whose name she remembered was Noah, peered out at her. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale and drawn. He asked, his voice a low, suspicious mumble, "Can I help you?" Margaret began, her voice the picture of polite, neighborly concern. "I'm sorry to bother you, young man. I'm Margaret, from next door. I just have a strange question for you. Have you been hearing any noises? At night? A sort of tapping sound?" The young man's expression changed. The suspicion in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. Fear. He said, his voice a little too quick, a little too sharp. "No, haven't heard anything. It's an old house. They make noise." He started to close the door. Margaret pressed, her own fear making her bold. "It's coming from the wall we share. Our bedroom wall. A very specific rhythmic tapping." Noah stopped. The door held open by a crack. He stared at her, and in his dark, tired eyes she saw a profound, haunted exhaustion that she recognized. It was the same exhaustion she saw in her own reflection every morning. He whispered, his voice cracking, "Please, just ignore it. Please. It's better if you just ignore it." And then he closed the door, the deadbolt sliding home with a final echoing thud. Margaret walked back to her house, her mind a storm of confusion and a new, dawning horror. He had heard it too. He knew what it was. And he was terrified. But what was it? And why did he want her to ignore it? The answer came not from a sound, but from a sight. That night, the tapping returned, the same steady, methodical rhythm. But this time, Margaret didn't stay in bed. She went to the guest room at the front of the house, a room she rarely used. The room had a single window that looked out not onto the street, but onto the narrow, dark alleyway that ran between her house and Noah's. She stood in the dark, peering through a crack in the blinds. The alley was a canyon of brick and shadow, and Then she saw it. A faint flickering light coming from a small, grimy basement window of Noah's house. The window was directly below his bedroom. The light was irregular, like a candle flame or a weak flashlight. She watched, her breath held, for nearly an hour. The tapping from her own bedroom continued its relentless, maddening rhythm. Then, the light in Noah's basement window went out, and at that exact same instant, the tapping in her own wall stopped. The connection was undeniable. The light and the sound were linked. The final horrifying piece of the puzzle was delivered to her doorstep the next morning. It was a small, plain brown paper-wrapped package with no return address. Her name was written on it in a shaky, almost illegible scroll. She took it inside, her hands trembling. Inside the package was a small, old leather-bound book. It was a ship's log from a whaling vessel in the 1800s and a small folded note. The note was from Noah. It read, "I'm sorry. I didn't want to involve you. I inherited this house from my grandfather, and I inherited his problem. The thing in the walls is not a ghost. It's him. My great-grandfather. He was the captain of a ship that went down in the Arctic. He was one of the few survivors. But what he and his men did to survive out on the ice, it broke him. When he came back, he was a different man. He was haunted. He sealed himself in the old root cellar of this house, a place he said was the only place he could feel safe from the icemen that followed him home. He lived down there, in the dark, for 30 years, tapping out messages on the water pipes to the outside world, a code only he understood. He died down there, but he never left. The tapping is him, a memory, an echo trapped in the house. But it's not just a sound. It's a key. When you hear it, it means he is awake. And when he is awake, he's not alone. The things that followed him home from the ice, they are awake too. They are drawn to the sound. I've seen them in the alley, in the yard. Tall, pale, silent. Things that move in the cold. The light you see in my window, that's me. I go down to the cellar every night. I use his old logbook. He was a good man before the ice. I read to him. I read him the stories of his old life, of the sea. It's the only thing that calms him. The only thing that makes the tapping stop. It's the only thing that keeps them at bay. The final lines of the note were a desperate, chilling plea. He's getting stronger. The tapping is lasting longer. I am so tired. I don't know how much longer I can keep reading to him. I'm leaving this for you, so that if one night the tapping starts and it does not stop, you will know what has happened. You will know that I have failed, and you will know that the things that were waiting in the alley are no longer just listening. They are coming inside." Margaret dropped the note, her body trembling. The tapping in her wall was not a haunting. It was a lullaby. A desperate, nightly ritual being performed by a terrified young man, trying to soothe the tormented ghost of his ancestor, trying to keep a host of unspeakable, patient horrors from spilling out of the shadows and into their shared, quiet, terrifying world.
Not yet. Not yet.
Our next story is about the ghosts of memory, and how a simple, beautiful melody can become the soundtrack to a living nightmare. It comes from a young family, Mark and Sarah, who bought a historic house full of charm and character. They learned that the faint, sweet song they heard every night from their attic was not a harmless echo of the past, but a real, present, and terrifying secret that was living and breathing just above their heads. For Mark and Sarah, the house was a love letter to a bygone era. They were preservationists at heart, a young couple who saw beauty not in new construction, but in the stories held by old wood and weathered brick. After years of saving, they had finally purchased their dream home, a beautifully restored, 3-story Victorian townhouse in the historic Starland district of Savannah. Georgia. The house on West 40th Street, with its ornate ironwork and a grand sweeping staircase, was more than they could truly afford. A constant source of financial anxiety that hummed just beneath the surface of their happiness. Mark was a history professor at Georgia Southern University's Armstrong campus, and Sarah was a freelance illustrator who worked from a sun-drenched studio on the second floor. Their life was a quiet, creative partnership, a world they had carefully built for themselves and their 7-year-old daughter, Lily. The house was their masterpiece, a living piece of history they were honored to inhabit. Lily was a child of quiet, intense imagination. She was prone to night terrors, a recurring fixture since she was a toddler. They were vague, formless nightmares that would leave her waking in a cold sweat, her small body trembling. Her pediatrician at Memorial Health had assured them it was a common phase she would likely outgrow. But for Mark and Sarah, every small cry from her room in the dead of night was a dagger to the heart. Their beautiful, historic home was a place of profound happiness, but also of a quiet, constant parental vigilance. The music started on a Tuesday night, exactly 1 month after they had moved in. It was just after 2 a.m. The house was silent. The only sound the soft, rhythmic breathing of the old building and the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn from the Savannah River. And then they heard it, a faint, delicate, and impossibly beautiful melody tinkling down from the ceiling above their bedroom. It was the sound of a music box. The tune was simple, haunting, and unfamiliar, a bittersweet waltz that seemed to speak of a deep, old sadness. It played for exactly 1 minute, then stopped, plunging the room back into silence. Mark and Sarah lay in the dark, their eyes wide, listening. Sarah whispered, "What was that?" Mark offered, though he knew it was a flimsy explanation. The neighbors? Their house was a townhouse, but the brick walls were a foot thick. They had never heard a single sound from either side. Maybe a phone alarm. The next night, it happened again. Exactly at 2:05 a.m. The same faint, beautiful, heartbreaking melody, drifting down from the attic above. It played for 1 minute, then stopped. The nightly concert became a part of their routine. Every night, a few minutes after 2 a.m., the invisible music box would play its sad, beautiful song. It wasn't frightening, not at first. It was strange, mysterious, and in a way, almost beautiful. This was a historic house, after all. It was bound to have its quirks, its ghosts. They were living inside a story, and the music box was simply the soundtrack. Sarah, a romantic at heart, began to call the unseen musician the tiny dancer. It was Lily who gave the ghost a face, Ambience. Few weeks after the music started, she woke up from one of her night terrors, screaming. When Sarah rushed into her room, Lily was sitting up in bed, her small body trembling, pointing not at a monster in her closet, but at the ceiling. She sobbed. The tiny dancer was here, Mommy. She was sad. She was looking for her music. From that night on, Lily's nightmares took on a new, specific shape. She would dream of a sad little girl with long, dark hair, who would wander the halls of their house, humming a familiar, haunting melody. Mark and Sarah tried to rationalize it. Lily must have overheard them, talking about the tiny dancer. They were unintentionally feeding her childhood fears, but a part of them, a part that was growing colder and more afraid, knew that it was more than that. Driven by a need for answers, Sarah did what she did best. She researched. She spent a day at the Georgia Historical Society on Whitaker Street, poring over old property records and city archives for their address. The history of the house was rich, but one story stood out. In the early 1900s, the house had been owned by a wealthy ship merchant named Alistair Finch. He had a young daughter named Clara, who was, by all accounts, the light of his life. In 1912, at the age of 9, Clara had died tragically, a victim of a sudden virulent strain of influenza. The article mentioned that her most prized possession was an ornate, custom-made music box from Switzerland, a gift from her father that played a unique, one-of-a-kind melody he had commissioned just for her. After her death, the grief-stricken father had sealed her bedroom and the attic, leaving them as a permanent, untouched shrine to his lost daughter. He had died in the house a few years later. A man, the article said, who was haunted by the sound of a silent melody. Sarah sat in the quiet, dusty archive, a chill running down her spine. The tiny dancer was real. Her name was Clara, and her song, the one they heard every night, was the sound of a century of grief, an echo of a love so profound it had refused to fade. The story was beautiful, tragic, and deeply, profoundly sad. But it was no longer just a charming ghost story. It was a haunting, and it was happening in their house. Mark, the engineer, was less romantic about it. He needed a physical explanation. One Saturday, he decided to confront the ghost. He pulled down the folding ladder to the attic, a space they had barely glanced at since moving in. He climbed up, a heavy flashlight in his hand, a sense of grim determination on his face. The attic was a vast, dark space that ran the full length of the house. Its air thick with the smell of old wood and dust. It was completely empty. There were no old trunks, no forgotten furniture, no boxes. And most importantly, there was no music box. He searched every corner, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but the space was bare. He was about to climb back down, frustrated and confused, when his light caught on something on the far wall. It was a door, a small, child-sized door, painted a faded white that was not on any of the house's blueprints. It had a small, tarnished, brass doorknob, but no keyhole. He tried the knob. It was locked. Solidly. He pushed against it, but it didn't budge. It was a door to nowhere, a forgotten appendix in the anatomy of the house. He went back downstairs, the mystery deeper than ever. The story of Clara and her sealed room now felt chillingly real. The door in the attic had to be the entrance to her lost bedroom, and the music box was inside. That night, the music played at its usual time, but this time, Mark and Sarah heard something new. Underneath the faint, tinkling melody, they heard another sound, a soft, rhythmic weeping, the sound of a child crying in the dark. That was the breaking point. This was no longer a benign haunting. It was a tragedy, a child's spirit trapped and in pain. They had to do something. They had to get into that room. The next day, Mark went to the attic armed with a crowbar. He stood before the small, white door, a feeling of profound transgression washing over him. He was about to break into a tomb. He wedged the crowbar into the seam of the door and pulled. The old wood groaned and splintered. He pulled again, and the door burst open, revealing a wall of absolute darkness. A wave of cold, musty air, smelling of lavender and decay, washed over him. He shone his flashlight into the opening. It was a room, a small, perfectly preserved child's bedroom from the early 1900s. A small, canopied bed stood against the far wall. A child's rocking chair sat in the corner, and on a small, marble-topped table by the window sat the music box. It was a beautiful, ornate thing made of dark, polished wood and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. On its lid was a small silver ballerina. They had found it, the source of the music. The heart of the haunting. But as Mark stepped into the room, his foot kicked something on the floor. He angled his flashlight down. It was not an old, forgotten toy. It was a modern digital audio player, a small, silver iPod from a decade ago. And connected to it, snagging across the floor and up the wall, was a thin, almost invisible speaker wire. The wire led to a tiny, high-fidelity speaker, hidden in the grill of an old, non-functional heating vent in the corner of the room. a vent that connected directly to the attic space above his and Sarah's bedroom. His mind reeled, the supernatural explanation shattering into a million terrifyingly logical pieces. The music wasn't a ghost. It was a recording. And then he saw the rest of it in the corner of the room. Behind the old rocking chair was a nest of dirty blankets, empty water bottles, and a pile of granola bar wrappers. And a diary, a modern, spiral-bound notebook. He picked it up, his hands trembling. The handwriting was a messy, frantic scrawl. The first entry was from 3 years ago. I found it today, the key. It was hidden in the old grandfather clock. Downstairs, it opened the little door in the attic. Her room, it's just like he described it. It's safe here, no one knows I'm here. No one can find me. He flipped through the pages, a story of quiet, desperate survival unfolding before him. It was the diary of a young woman. A runaway, a squatter. She had found the secret room and had been living there, a ghost in their house, for years, long before they had ever bought it. She would sneak out at night, through a loose window in the back of the house, to get food and water. The previous owner, an elderly man who was hard of hearing, had never noticed. He reached the final entries from the last few weeks after they had moved in. There's a new family, a man and a woman, and a little girl. She reminds me of Clara. I can hear them through the vents. They seem kind. The little girl has nightmares. It makes me sad. I found the old music box. The whining mechanism is broken, but I found a recording of the melody online. I'd play it for the little girl at night. I'd play it from my old iPod. I think it helps her sleep. It's a secret lullaby. From one lonely girl to another. The last entry was from the night before. The man is in the attic. He found the door. He's going to break it down. He's going to find me. He's going to expose my secret. I'm so scared. He is a good man, I think. But he is not my father. He will not understand. I have to leave. I have to find a new quiet place. I'm sorry, Clara. I'm so sorry, Lily. Mark stood in the small, silent, secret room, the diary in his hand, the truth a heartbreaking weight in his chest. The tiny dancer wasn't a ghost from a century ago. She was a real, living, and terrified young woman who had found a strange, symbiotic, and ultimately untenable sanctuary in the forgotten heart of their home. The music box hadn't been a haunting. It had been a kindness, a secret, anonymous act of empathy from one lost soul to another. He walked out of the room and gently closed the broken door behind him. He never told Sarah the full story. He just told her that he had found the old music box, that it had a faulty clockwork mechanism that made it play at odd hours, and that he had fixed it. The music never played again. Lily's nightmares slowly began to fade. The house on West 40th Street became quiet once more. But for Mark, the silence is no longer a comfort. It is a question. He's haunted by the knowledge of the secret life that had been lived just a few feet from his own. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is still, he finds himself standing in the hallway, listening not for the sound of a music box, but for the soft, gentle weeping of the girl who had been their secret, silent, and deeply kind ghost.
Don't step into the dark.
Our final story is not about a sound that haunted a single house, but one that has haunted an entire town for generations. It's about a collective mystery, a piece of local folklore so persistent and terrifying that it has become a part of the landscape itself. It comes from a small, isolated town in Tennessee, a place that learned that the most enduring horrors are the ones that are born from a real, unspeakable tragedy, and that the sound of a baby crying from deep within the vomit of unspeakable tragedy, and that the sound of a baby crying from deep within Woods is a secret that the forest will never, ever give up. The town of Tellico Plains, Tennessee, is a place on the edge. It's a small, quiet community nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, the last stop before the vast, untamed wilderness of the Cherokee National Forest swallows. The landscape hold. It's a town of deep roots, of families who have lived on the same land for centuries. And it's a town with a ghost. Not a ghost in a haunted house, but a ghost in the air. A ghost made of sound. They call it the crying. For as long as anyone can remember, on still moonless nights, a sound will drift down from the deep, dark hollows of the national forest. It is the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. Not the cry of a mountain lion, not the shriek of a bobcat. Local hunters and woodsmen, men who know the forest's symphony by heart, will tell you that with a grim, unwavering certainty. It is the sound of a human infant, a desperate, heartbreaking wail that echoes through the trees, and then, just as suddenly as it begins, it stops. It has been happening for decades. It is a part of the town's identity, a shared, terrifying secret. Our story comes from a man named Daniel, who, in the summer of 2019, made the fateful decision to move there. Daniel was a writer, a man seeking refuge from the noise of his own life. The recent death of his wife in a car accident had shattered his world, leaving him adrift in a sea of grief in his bustling, memory-filled hometown of Nashville. He needed silence. He needed solitude. He found a small rental cabin on the edge of Tellico Plains, on a gravel road that dead-ended at the boundary of the national forest. The cabin was his hermitage, a place to heal, a place to be alone with the ghost of his wife. He did not yet know that the forest had a ghost of its own. For the first few months, the solitude was a balm. He spent his days hiking the endless trails of the forest, the silence of the ancient trees, a comforting presence. He spent his nights on his porch, listening to the symphony of the wilderness, trying to write, trying to find his way back to himself. The town was welcoming, but in a reserved Appalachian way. He'd make his weekly trip to the local grocery store, the Tellico Grains Bakery, for coffee, and exchange quiet, polite nods with the locals. He was an outsider, and he knew it. He first heard about the crying from the old man who ran the hardware store on Cherahala Skyway. Daniel was buying a new axe handle. The old man, a grizzled local named Silas with eyes that had seen too much, looked out the window at the darkening mountains. His voice was a low rumble. Gonna be a clear night. Still, quiet. You'll probably hear it tonight. Daniel had asked. Hear what? Silas just gave him a long, knowing look. The baby. That night, Daniel sat on his porch, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and listened. The night was profoundly still. The sky a black velvet blanket studded with a billion stars. Around 1 a.m., he heard it. It was distant, faint, but unmistakable. The high-pitched, desperate wail of a newborn baby, crying from deep within the dark. Silent forest. It lasted for maybe 2 minutes, a sound of pure, unadulterated distress that raised the hair on his arms. And then it was gone, leaving a silence that felt deeper, more profound than before. He was a rational man. He spent the next day researching. He learned about the local legend of the crying. He also learned about the logical explanations. The screech owl, whose call can sometimes mimic a human scream. The bobcat, the wind playing tricks in the hollows. He chose to believe the logical explanations. It was easier. But he heard it again a week later, and again the week after that. The sound was always the same. It was always from the same general direction, a deep, inaccessible hollow a few miles into the forest. And it was always the same heartbreaking, human sound. The logical explanations began to feel thin, threadbare. The sound was a mystery, and the writer in him, the part of him that was always searching for a story, was hooked. He began his own quiet investigation. He started talking to the older residents of the town, the keepers of its history. He spent hours at the Monroe County Archives, poring over old maps and newspaper records. Most people were reluctant to talk about it. It was a local superstition, a dark piece of folklore they didn't like to share with outsiders. But he was patient. He was a good listener, and slowly, piece by painful piece, he began to assemble the story. The story was not a ghost story. It was a real human tragedy that had happened 60 years ago. In the 1950s, a young, impoverished couple had been living in a small, unrecorded cabin deep in the woods, in the very hollow where the crying was said to originate. They had a newborn baby. It was a hard winter. They were isolated, cut off from the town by snow and their own fierce Appalachian pride. The baby had gotten sick. A fever. They had tried to walk out, to get to a doctor in Tellico Plains, but a blizzard had trapped them. The baby had died in their arms. The story said that the parents, mad with grief, had simply vanished. They had left the cabin, left the body of their child, and had walked off into the forest, never to be seen again. The cabin had been swallowed. By the woods, the baby had been left behind. The story was a heartbreaking piece of local history, but it didn't explain the sound that had persisted for 6 decades. Daniel became obsessed. The mystery of the crying became the new center of his life, a tangible puzzle that pushed his own grief into the background. He bought high-tech audio recording equipment, parabolic microphones, and spectrum analyzers. He spent his nights on the edge of the forest, trying to get a clean recording of the sound, trying to triangulate its precise location. The recordings were chilling. When he ran them through his analysis software, he could see that the sound was not an animal. The waveform, the frequency, the cadence, it was undeniably the cry of a human infant. But the recordings also picked up a second sound, something he hadn't been able to hear with his own ears. A sound that was buried deep underneath the crying, at a frequency that was almost subliminal. It was a low, rhythmic, mechanical humming. The two sounds were linked, the crying and the machine. He finally pinpointed the location. It was a small, almost inaccessible hollow, about 3 miles into the national forest, in a section of the park that was rugged, untrailed, and rarely visited. He knew he had to go. He had to see the source. He set out on a clear, cold morning, a backpack with his equipment, a GPS, and a powerful flashlight on his back. The hike was brutal, a steep, off-trail climb through dense thickets of rhododendron and over slippery, moss-covered rocks. After 4 hours of grueling hiking, he found it. The hollow was a small, natural amphitheater surrounded by towering, ancient hemlock trees. The air was cold, still, and in the center of the hollow, almost completely consumed by the forest floor, were the ruins of a small, old cabin. Just a few rotting foundation logs and a crumbling stone chimney, a silent testament to a forgotten life. He spent the next hour searching the ruins, his heart pounding. He found old, rusted farm tools, a broken piece of a ceramic plate, but he found no sign of a grave, no sign of the baby. He was about to give up, to write the whole thing off as a local legend with no resolution, when he saw it, a thin black wire, almost completely hidden by a thick carpet of moss, running from the base of the old chimney and disappearing into the dense undergrowth. It was a modern insulated outdoor electrical cable. He followed the wire. It led him about 50 yards from the cabin ruins to a small rocky TCROP. And there, hidden in a small crevice behind a curtain of hanging moss, he found it. It was a metal box, an army surplus ammunition can, just like the one from our previous story, rusted and heavy. The wire led directly into a small, drilled hole in its side. He pried the rusted lid open. Inside, nestled in a bed of rotting foam, was a strange homemade device. It was an old, battery-powered cassette tape player, the kind from the 1970s. It was connected to a small, but powerful, weatherproof outdoor speaker, and it was all wired to a modern, high-capacity lithium-ion battery, a battery that was, in turn, connected to a small, flexible solar panel that was camouflaged on top of the rock, perfectly positioned to catch the dappled sunlight that filtered through the trees. This was not an echo. This was not a ghost. This was a machine that was designed to play a sound at specific intervals, powered by the sun, for years on end. He reached into the box and took out the cassette tape. The label was handwritten. The ink faded but still legible. It read, "For my son, so no one will ever forget." He had found the source, but he had not found the story. Who had built this strange, heartbreaking, and technologically sophisticated memorial, and why? He sat there in the silent, sun-dappled hollow, the cassette tape in his hand, a feeling of profound, almost sacred mystery washing over him. He was about to put the tape in his pocket and hike back to town, back to the archives, when he heard a sound. A twig snapping. He froze. He looked up. Standing at the edge of the hollow, watching him, was a man. He was an old man, probably in his late 80s, with a long white beard and eyes that were a pale, piercing blue. He was wearing old, worn hunting clothes and leaning on a gnarled, wooden walking stick. He was a ghost from the mountains, a man who belonged to the forest. The old man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "You found it. I figured someone would, eventually." "Who are you?" Daniel whispered. "My name is Samuel," the old man said. "And the baby was my brother." And in the quiet, sunlit hollow, the old man told him the rest of the story. The official account, the one Daniel had found in the archives, was a lie, a cover-up. His parents hadn't been poor. His father had been a successful engineer, working on a top-secret government project at the nearby Oak Ridge National Laboratory during the Cold War. They had been living in the cabin under an assumed name, hiding. His father had discovered something, a secret so dangerous he had decided to disappear with his family, to hide them in the deep woods where no one would find them. But they had been found. Samuel whispered, his old eyes dark with a lifetime of memory. They weren't government agents. They were something else. The men my father was running from, they came to the cabin one night. I was just a boy, 7 years old. They wanted his research. He refused. There was a struggle. My mother and my father, they were killed. He paused, a single tear tracing a path through the deep wrinkles on his face. I hid. I hid in the root cellar under the cabin. But my brother, the baby, he started to cry, and they heard him. He didn't have to say the rest. Daniel could see the scene in his mind, a horrifying tableau of violence and loss. Samuel continued, his voice a hoarse whisper. I was the only one who survived. I lived in these woods for a year, like an animal, before a hunter found me. They put me in the system, foster homes, orphanages, but I never forgot. I never forgot. The sound of my brother crying. Daniel asked, gesturing to the device in the box. So you built this? Samuel nodded. Years later, after I was grown, I came back. I found the ruins of our home. I built this memorial, a grave marker made of sound. I wanted to make sure that someone, anyone, would still hear my brother's voice. I wanted to make sure that this place, this hollow, would be haunted, not by a ghost, but by a memory, a real memory, of what they did here. He looked at Daniel, his pale blue eyes filled with a profound, weary sadness. The crying, it keeps the story alive, but it also keeps people away. It keeps this place sacred. It keeps it safe. It keeps me safe. The final, impossible piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The old man, Samuel, he wasn't just visiting. He had never left. He had spent his entire life out here, a hermit, a ghost in his own right, the silent, patient guardian of his family's tragic secret and the keeper of the cry. Samuel whispered, his gaze drifting to the dark woods beyond the hollow. They're still out there. You know, the men who did this, they're not government. They are something older. They never stop looking for my father's research. They are still hunting. A floorboard creaked in the ruins of the cabin behind them. Daniel and Samuel both froze, their eyes locking in a shared, silent moment of pure terror. The sound hadn't been the house settling Dot. It had been a footstep. They were not alone in the hollow. The story of the crying in the forest wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't a legend, Dot. It was a warning. A 60-year-old alarm. A beacon of sound designed to keep people away from a place where an ancient, patient, and very real evil was still hunting. And Daniel, in his obsessive quest to find the source of the story, had just walked right into its final terrible chapter. A hum from a forgotten weapon buried beneath the home. A rhythmic tapping from a desperate man soothing a ghost. A sweet melody that was not a haunting, but a secret kindness. And a child's cry that was a 60-year-old warning. These 4 stories began with a simple, common annoyance, a noise, but they all unraveled into a terrifying, fundamental truth. The most maddening prison is not a room with a locked door, Dot. It is a sound you cannot escape. A visual threat, a monster in the shadows, is something you can fight, something you can run from. But a sound is different, Dot. It's an invasion of a different kind, Dot. It bypasses your locks. It seeps through your walls. It takes up residence directly inside your own mind, Dot. It turns your most private, silent moments into a state of constant, anxious listening, Dot. It makes you question your own sanity, turning your own perception into a weapon against you. The true horror in these accounts is the ambiguity, the endless, torturous search for a source that defies all logic, Dot. It leaves us with a chilling realization. Our homes, our sanctuaries, are not silent. They are filled with the echoes of the past, the secrets of the land, and the quiet, desperate signals of the people all around us, Dot. And it forces us to ask a terrifying question. The next time you hear a sound in your house that you can't explain, are you sure you're the only one who is listening? If these stories have made the silence in your own home feel a little heavier, prove you are still here by subscribing to Whispered Fear, leaving a like, and sharing this video. Your support helps us to amplify the whispers that hide in the noise. But what if the disturbance isn't a sound from the outside, but a memory from within? A feeling so familiar, it feels like you've lived this exact moment before. Because maybe you have clicked the video on your screen now for our next journey into the uncanny. 6 true tales of deja vu that turn sinister. See you there for the first time. Again.